Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're wondering, could it be Clinton versus Bush just like in 1992? Only this time, of course, it would be Jeb Bush against Hillary Clinton. We're talking about it with Josh Krasauer, political editor for the National Journal. I see the most read story on your website is a slideshow showing baby pictures of many of the Bushes. That I noticed. Also with us from Tallahassee, Florida, Rick Wilson, who is a strategist for the Republican Party. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Stuart Haugen, former chair of Republicans Abroad here in France, and Laetitia Vito, who teaches politics, U.S. politics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Before the break, we heard Rick Wilson describe how voters today, with new technology, yes, there's silly money involved in a presidential race in America, but with new technology and social media, you can have more pickings and a more, I guess you could say, a more fragmented field for a more fragmented electorate.
That's true. That's what was shown in the California governor race when the candidate tried to invest 140 million of her own dollars to win the governorship. It's true that money is not enough. However, Romney proved in 2012 that money does help a lot. And Rick Santorum didn't have enough, even if he had some momentum. He basically had no fuel left. The same happened to Gingrich, who was completely on his own. So with $100 million already in his war chest, with his super PAC, The Right to Rise, beautiful name, The Right to Rise, Jeb Bush does have a big asset. Doesn't mean it's enough, but it will help.
All right, and we were mentioning before the break how one of his big problems is his name. While he tries to distance himself from his brother, the Democratic frontrunner this week distanced herself from President Obama. Hillary Clinton siding against her former boss as Secretary of State and with the Democratic House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, this in a row over a quick ratification of a free trade deal with Asia-Pacific nations.
I believe that with the vote on Friday, the president has an opportunity to reach out to the Democratic caucus in the House, in particular to Leader Pelosi, to see whether there could not be a chance to use that as leverage to create some of the changes that have been asked for by people who are concerned about what is in the current draft of the TPP.
Josh Krasauer, can we expect now, we know there we see Hillary Clinton siding with the trade unions on this particular issue, which is new free trade agreements. But can we expect more of these kinds of cases where she'll be distancing herself from Barack Obama?
Possibly, though I wouldn't count on it. This was a political twofer. It allowed her an opportunity to distance herself from a president who's relatively unpopular, underwater job approval ratings here at home, while also energizing the base, which is very much in the Democratic Party against the fast-track free trade agreement and have been skeptical about free trade agreements generally, not just now, but for decades past. But the challenge is for Hillary Clinton is that the energy in her party is to the left, to the far left. And you see that with Bernie Sanders of all candidates, a self-proclaimed socialist senator in the United States, getting the most energy out of all of her challengers running against her. And her challenge is, even though she doesn't have the strongest tier of challengers running against her in the primary, she's clearly felt the need to position herself in the leftward side of the party because she just doesn't want to be shunned by the base in the way that could hurt her in a general election. But it certainly suggests that she's more worried about her base than winning over undecided voters in the middle of the electorate.
It seems, though, that she does have an easier ride than the presumptive front runner on the Republican side.
Oh, absolutely. She's certainly the heavy front runner for the nomination. So the fact that she's feeling the need to cater to the liberal base, to the flank to her left, suggests that she's worried about the energy in her party having moved to the left, even though she doesn't have to worry like a Jeb Bush or any of the other Republican frontrunners do about winning the nomination as aggressively.
Rick Wilson, what will be the issue that will swing the Republican nomination?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be not a particular issue, but the perception inside the Republican base that the person that is going to post up against Hillary Clinton in the general election is somebody who has the charisma, the engagement, a prospective, optimistic vision for the future that makes them a candidate that energizes and motivates people, and not just wants to go and slug it out on a series of policy points back and forth. I mean, at the end of the day, we blew it in 2008 by not understanding we weren't running against Barack Obama's policies. We were running against the celebrity that was Barack Obama. We didn't understand that until far too late. And it's important that we have somebody that has a certain presence and charisma and an ability to motivate people in my side and in the middle. That frankly, I think Hillary Clinton is one of the big risk factors for her, is that she's having to work this hard to motivate her base. She's having to work this diligently to convince the left-wing base of her party that she's okay. I mean, I grant you, if this is a base-only election for her and she feels like she can roll up enough electoral votes with 10 states, that may make some sense, but it's a high-risk strategy. And I think that Republicans have a lot more options in how they communicate going forward in the election.
Stuart Haugen, we talked about trying to diversify the electorate when it comes to the Republicans. We all remember back in 2012 at the Republican convention, there was that speech by Clint Eastwood to the empty chair. Critics said it made the Republicans look like a party of old white men. Whoever wins is going to have to convince female voters to pick the Republicans.
Well, let's be candid. We have been a party of old white men for a long time, but not any longer. We have a bench. We have diversity on the bench. We have a broad spectrum of views that are going to be debated and chosen. And that's something the Democrats are sadly lacking this year. Obama's failures in the last two midterm elections have kneecapped, have destroyed the Democratic bench. There are no young Democrats coming up. We've got Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren. I mean, talk about old white people. So I think very old white people, frankly. So yes. I think the Republicans, for the first time, have a diversity. They have this. Now, how we play that is going to be very, very important. And there's no guarantee we're going to win. But I think Hillary's biggest problem is said, if she plays too much to the center, she will not get her base out. And she's not going to get the same turnout that Barack Obama got from the black community. She's not probably going to draw the same Hispanic vote, if we choose well on the Republican side, that Barack Obama got as well. So I think she's in a delicate position. I think she's in a powerful position, but she's playing a lot of cards right now, and how she plays them is going to be very, very, very important.
Laetitia Vito, do you, as a French citizen, relish the prospect of Hillary Clinton, say, against Jeb Bush? Is that something you would look forward to?
I don't look forward to something like that. It looks like a clash of supermarket chains. It looks like
well said.
The Perfect. American democracy is unhealthy and unable to produce new faces, and that money controls everything, or that connections control everything. It would be sad. It is a very likely outcome now. It's a possible outcome because I believe Bush is well positioned. Doesn't mean he is sure to win the nomination, but it's a possibility. So I don't relish the prospect of him, of both of them being in the race.
Josh Kraushaar, do you agree? And are you wary of basically your readers getting a bit bored of the campaign if it's these familiar names?
Well, there is a big disconnect, at least on the Republican side, between Jeb Bush and what party leaders in Washington view of his candidacy. And I think these polls have a lot of foundation to them. I was just in New Hampshire last week, and you talk about Jeb Bush, and he's just one of many candidates that Republican voters, are considering. And it's not just about ideology. There is that baggage that your guest talks about is on the minds of a lot of voters. Do we really need to nominate a Bush to run up against a Clinton? That's Jeb Bush's biggest problem, and it's one he can't really change. change. It's fundamental to his biography. So I'm not quite as bullish that Jeb Bush is going to be the Republican nominee. I think Marco Rubio, if voters are looking at electability, they might judge that Rubio makes a stronger contrast against someone like Hillary Clinton. And Scott Walker also, I think, is in that first tier and might be a stronger candidate against Hillary Clinton as well. So I would not automatically assume this is going to be a Bush-Clinton general election matchup. Democrats seem to have put all their chips on the Clinton name, but I don't think Republicans are even close to that point for Jeb Bush.
And Josh, you've explained to us in previous shows how America has become more polarized, how there's less of a middle ground than there used to be on Capitol Hill. But explain to us why these dynasties exist, why it's Clinton versus Bush that we're talking about.
It's just like having a brand name gives you a head start. People don't know who a lot of new candidates are because they don't follow politics like you and I do and like a lot of political professionals do. So if you're Hillary Clinton and you're Jeb Bush, people know the names, they know the brand. And that gives you a name identification, it gives you a great head start, and it gives you, in the case of Clinton and Bush, the opportunity to access a lot of donor money earlier and more aggressively than other upstart candidates. But just like in business, so the upstart company often has advantages that the more monopolistic company often doesn't have. And that's what someone like Marco Rubio certainly is betting on when in his candidacy. He has a smaller team, but a very, very smart team of operatives around him, and he has a very strong message seeking to contrast his future-oriented argument against Hillary Clinton. And you can't underestimate the ability for a really ambitious startup to take on a monopoly, both in business and in politics. So Absolutely. While you have Bush and Clinton getting out to very strong starts, or they're the biggest names in their respective fields, I think as time goes on, we'll hear a lot more about these challengers and give a real opportunity for more of a competition than you would expect right now.
All right, the issue, of course, that interests our viewers on France 24 is foreign policy. And in his announcement speech, Jeb Bush, in stark contrast with the isolationist wing of his party, promising a U.S. that can impose itself on the world stage.
From the beginning, our president and his foreign policy team have been so eager to be the history makers that they failed to be the peacemakers. With their phone-it-in foreign policy, the Obama, Clinton, Kerry team is leaving a legacy of crises uncontained, violence unopposed, enemies unnamed, friends undefended, and alliances unraveling.
All right, that's for Jeb Bush. For her part, Hillary Clinton, still wary, it seems, when you listen to her, of foreign expeditions gone wrong in the past.
The United States can't do this alone. We shouldn't do it alone. We have to lead the world because the alternative to us leading the world is a vacuum that will be filled by some pretty dangerous characters. So we do have to lead the world, but we need to lead it by pulling everybody together and moving in the same direction.
So their views differ, Rick Wilson, but they overlap to a certain degree. America, both of those candidates say, has to be engaged in the world. Let me ask you, within the Republican Party, who's winning that argument over isolationists versus those who want to be more engaged with the rest of the world?
Look, at the end of the day, the foreign policy numbers in the Republican Party, there's going to be a small part of it in the Rand Paul spectrum of the party that still has a sort of the Pat Buchanan tradition of neo-isolationism or isolationism. It's always a small factor. It's always a small fraction. For most Republicans, they look at America's role in the world, and they look at a world that has become increasingly dangerous during the Obama years, and a chain of failures in the Obama-Clinton foreign policy that they believe are very relevant now in ways that have made us less safe. The spread of ISIS, the disaster in Libya, the collapse of the Arab Spring that turned into something much more negative and risky for America, the rise of the Iranian nuclear program in the last 8 years. All these things for Republican-based voters, they're terribly concerned about because they still believe that this is a world with actual risks and consequential risks that haven't been addressed in the 8 years of Obama.
But Rick Wilson, on that point, when we were just last week discussing the threat of mission creep in Iraq with the U.S. sending 450 more advisors, panelists were pointing out that public opinion is with Obama on this one. Nobody wants to go back to war in Iraq. And they were also saying, Rick Wilson, that the Republicans don't seem to have an alternative plan either for taking on ISIS.
Well, look, right now there is no. Right now we're doing nitpick airstrikes against ISIS and some limited special operations things that haven't really constrained the spread of this group. And the fact of the matter is, if they get to the gates of Baghdad, this is going to be a totally different picture. And unless we engage more effectively against them, and whether that means more troops on the ground, whether that means more trainers, whether that means an enhanced level, looser rules of engagement on the air campaign, that's a matter for military experts. But right now there is a perception that while Americans don't want to go back to war in Iraq, they also don't perceive that Barack Obama is doing a good job of containing ISIS and handling foreign policy threats. So there is a space there for Republicans to communicate on this issue.
Stuart Haugen, again, I raise this point because we see John McCain regularly make speeches. He's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, very hawkish, saying we should be doing more in Syria, we should be doing more in Iraq. But, of course, that more means sending troops.
Yeah, it does, and I think the American people are still conflicted on that issue. But I would say, you say Republicans don't seem to have a plan. Barack Obama's not listening to his own Pentagon. Why would he listen to Republicans on this? We don't have a platform to create foreign policy and to interact with the commander-in-chief like his own people do, his own advisors. The military is saying we have to be more rigorous here. This is serious, and he's not listening to them either.
All right, lots of reactions have been coming in, by the way, for us on Facebook and Twitter, and a lot of fatigue with both Bush and Clinton, it's got to be said. Daniel, for instance, mentioning, because we were talking earlier about Donald Trump announcing he was running for president this Tuesday, saying Trump is the perfect icing on this ridiculous Clinton-Bush political cake we are being force-fed. Laetitia Vito, how do the French feel about it? We all remember the French foreign minister went to the United States, what was it, a year and a half ago? Mm-hmm. He gave a speech in New York where he bemoaned the retreat of the United States from the world stage.
Yes, but when it comes to foreign policy, to go back to Bush's campaign, I think it would be a mistake. It would have been a mistake for him not to capitalize on his father's legacy. He has had more difficulties with his brother's foreign policy legacy, but if he can make people remember his father a little bit more, I mean, Bush 41 was the one who ended the Cold War, who was the most successful and popular president on foreign policy issues.
But he got beaten by Clinton.
He got beaten by Clinton because of domestic issues, not foreign policy issues. He thought he would win because of foreign policy, but then came a recession, and it was all about domestic policy. And I think that this year, it's not, unless something else happens, it's not going to be that much about foreign policy, but more about domestic issues. Americans may be concerned, of course, about ISIS, but it's probably not going to be the core subject of this campaign.
And either way, do you see U.S. foreign policy changing after the election?
Either way, as both said, Bush said about Clinton, they were on the same side in 2005. So I don't think that would be very different.
Well, there might be a difference in the simple fact that nobody trusts Barack Obama anymore worldwide. Mm. He has lost all credibility on the foreign policy front. And
really?
As a partner, as an ally, he has no credibility. He talks a lot. He does nothing. If we had somebody in office who our allies and our partners, our friends, might actually trust to deliver, we might see a shift in opinion to take a harder front on ISIS and some others and to actually act. Nobody's going to follow Barack Obama. Well, he's leading from behind. You can't follow him.
It might be difficult with a Bush, too.
I don't know. We'll see. I share your concern, but I think if we had a credible president who was a leader as opposed to a talker, I think we might have a different reaction from our partners.
Josh Kraushaar, again, I've got to ask you here. We throughout this whole discussion, we've heard two Republicans still hedging their bets over Jeb Bush. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's really interesting. You talk about national security and how that fits into the Republican field. It's striking to see the disconnect. Republicans, if you look at some of the recent polls out, national security is the #1 issue for a plurality of Republicans. It even tops the economy in some polls that have been out there recently. Whereas for Democrats, it's a secondary issue. So when you heard Jeb Bush talk about foreign policy and a much more aggressive American role overseas, whereas Hillary Clinton barely even talked about her record as Secretary of State, the most recent resume point, which seemed to be the foundation of her entire presidential campaign as recently as several months ago, it really shows you the disconnect between the two parties and the polarization in Washington. And I think you really do have a different vision outside of Rand Paul within the Republican Party between what most of the mainstream Republican candidates are calling for in a more assertive American role overseas versus what Hillary Clinton is talking about. And even some of her advisors are publicly saying that they don't think foreign policy is an important or significant issue at all politically for most Americans. So there's this political divide where both Republicans and Democratic strategists see the impact of foreign policy and the import of foreign policy in totally different ways.
Not important at all, but I mean, has the memory of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq faded, Josh Kraushaar?
The memories of maybe the Iraq War have faded, but certainly not the threat that ISIS poses and the threat that they pose to potentially the U.S. homeland. And if you talk to Republican voters, that's an anxiety and a fear that's on the forefront of many GOP voters' minds. Whereas you see Democrats not being quite as nervous and anxious about that very issue. So there's a partisan divide over terrorism and national security, and there's also a strategic divide in how most of the Republican candidates view how this will play in a general election, how Obama's record on foreign policy will play in a general election, whereas Republicans think it's a major vulnerability for Hillary Clinton, and Clinton feels like she doesn't even need to bring it front and center in her own campaign speeches.
All right.
Well,
go ahead.
I think
Rick
I
Wilson.
think, Joe, that part of this is that Hillary Clinton recognizes that her resume as Secretary of State leaves an awful lot to be desired. The Russian reset is a cataclysmic failure in terms of a signature foreign policy accomplishment by Hillary Clinton. Libya, Egypt, Syria, the relations with Israel, relations with Iran, all of these things under Hillary Clinton have made America and have made Americans feel meaningfully less safe in the world. And so I think one of the reasons they're saying it's not an issue is because they don't want to get into a detailed examination of the policy and political and diplomatic failures of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State.
Could either party have, for instance, stopped the Russians from annexing Crimea?
Listen, there were a lot of things that were probably pretty strong signals to the Russians in terms of our relationship with our other NATO allies, in terms of things we could have been doing with missile defense, say, in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and things that would have influenced, I think, Russian thinking in some meaningful ways. And maybe it wouldn't have fully constrained Putin, but if you continue to act with weakness and diffidence over and over again in the foreign policy domain, which with Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton have both done, you are going to encourage bad actors like Vladimir Putin, who are going to get frisky and are going to get...
Rick Wilson, that seems to be a broader problem that you touch on, which is when the crisis broke out in Ukraine, many said U.S. diplomats, well, they didn't seem to pass the mustard compared to diplomats of old. Right. That's not a Democratic or Republican problem. It gets back to what Josh Kraushaar was saying about disengagement and disinterest with things that are happening abroad.
We will pay a terrible price for that disinterest, as we have seen time and time and time again. And the false dichotomy here isn't millions of Americans invading other countries versus Barack Obama's leading from behind Nobel Peace Prize foreign policy. The real question here is, do you shape an American foreign policy that is involved, is engaged, is forward-looking in a lot of these places that we know we're going to encounter large-scale problems? And right now, the footprint that Barack Obama created in the diplomatic service and in our foreign policy decisions that Hillary Clinton implemented for him has been one that I think very few people are comfortable with. And I think that is one of the reasons she does not want this to become an issue in this campaign. She does not want to get into an examination of the decisions she made and the failures implicit in those decisions.
All right, before we go, Josh Kraushaar, let me ask you, I'm not going to ask you who's going to win the nomination for the Republican Party because it's still early days, but let me ask you, because with Donald Trump today, we're now up to 12 candidates. How many do you think there'll be?
Well, there'll be Scott Walker is going to be announcing next month. Chris Christie, I was just covering him in New Hampshire last week, and I expect him to jump in the race as well. So you could get upwards of 15, 16. I think the three names to watch, the three first-tier candidates, will be Bush, Marco Rubio, also from Florida, and Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin. Those three are head and shoulders above the rest of the candidates who, there are another dozen or so or half dozen maybe or so that could make an impact at one point or another. But Walker, Rubio, and Jeb are clearly in that first tier of Republican candidates.
And two of them from Florida. It's something that, of course, we will continue to watch. I want to thank our panelists from Florida, Rick Wilson, for joining us from the capital, Tallahassee. Also want to thank as well Josh Kraushaar, Stuart Haugen, and Laetitia Vito. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.